In the sweltering heat of a Louisiana summer in 1867, a woman driven to the brink of desperation took a stand in the most dramatic way possible. She didn't wield a weapon of steel or stone, but a fire that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. Her name, we may never truly know. Her story, it's one of defiance, survival, and the relentless spirit of a woman who dared to challenge the unthinkable. But was she a hero or a criminal? Was she driven by vengeance or something much deeper, an act of freedom? If you're captivated by untold stories of resilience and defiance, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and share this powerful journey with others. Let's dive in. Imagine the scene, a vast plantation nestled deep in the heart of Louisiana, its rows of cotton stretching far beyond the horizon. Heavy with the sweat and labor of enslaved men and women, the air is thick with the scent of the earth and the desperate cries of those who toiled under the sun. But amid this grueling landscape, there existed a contradiction. The chapel, a place supposedly devoted to the divine, where the oppressed were told to seek solace, to pray for deliverance. But right next door, the brothel, a place of exploitation and violence where both men and women were reduced to mere objects of pleasure, bought and sold like cattle. The idea that a space devoted to worship could coexist with a den of degradation seems almost absurd in retrospect. Yet, in this time and place, it was an everyday reality. To the enslaved, these structures were not just symbols of their subjugation, they were reminders of the brutal system that trapped them in a cycle of suffering. But for one woman, these buildings would soon become the stage for an act that would set the entire plantation and her life on fire, both literally and figuratively. But what would lead her to such an extreme act? To destroy a place that some would have considered sacred? This was not just a simple outburst of rage. This was something much more profound. A statement that reverberated through every corner of that plantation. The chapel brothel represented the heart of the system that had abused her, and every ounce of pain, oppression, and humiliation she had suffered was now funneling into one explosive moment. You might be wondering what would drive someone to take such a dramatic step. What would it feel like to watch the building burn, knowing what it represented to so many others? Was it an act of revenge? Or was it something deeper, a desperate cry for freedom? She was a woman like many others, enslaved, silenced, invisible to most of the world. Yet, she was also unique, forged in the fires of a brutal existence that had stripped her of her humanity, piece by piece. We don't know her name, and that in itself speaks volumes. The records of her life were lost, erased in the margins of history. But her act of fire has become a legend, a symbol of defiance in an act that challenged everything that was taken from her. Born into a world where her body was not her own, where her labor was demanded, but her freedom was never promised. She learned early that survival meant playing by rules that were not of her choosing. She had seen in all the cruelties, the endless cycle of punishment, and the broken promises of salvation. She had heard the preachers, those men who stood in the pulpit of the plantation chapel, telling her that suffering on earth would be rewarded in the afterlife. But that message was hollow to her. What could she have possibly believed about a God who would allow such cruelty to persist unchecked? What could she have believed in the hollow words of those who preached from a pulpit, built on the backs of her people? The system that bound her to this land was not one of divine justice, it was one of human oppression. And so, she bided her time. She waited for the moment when the fire inside her would match the flames of destruction. She was preparing to unleash. Every day was a step closer to a decision she could no longer postpone. She had seen the brothel, the exploitation, the degradation, the sheer depravity that simmered beneath the surface of the plantation. She had witnessed the hypocrisy of those who justified their actions with twisted interpretations of faith, all while they subjected her and others to unspeakable horrors. It wasn't just about the brothel or the chapel. It was about the system that enabled both. It was about the men who hid behind their power, their religion, their wealth, believing themselves untouchable. And so, she made her choice. The chapel brothel would burn. But her choice was not an impulsive one. No, this was a woman who had studied the landscape of her oppression for years. She had learned the systems, observed the rhythms of her captors, and when the time came, she struck with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. Life on a plantation in the post-Civil War South was one of cruelty and desperation. A world where the idea of freedom was as distant as the stars themselves. For the enslaved, it was a brutal reality, one that squeezed the very life out of them, drop by painful drop. But in the oppressive heat of the Louisiana sun, where the fields stretched endlessly, there were small acts of resistance. The woman's life was marked by hardship from the moment she was born into this system. Like the others who worked the fields, she was treated as property, her worth determined solely by her ability to labor. From sunup to sundown, she worked the land, enduring physical pain, but the emotional and psychological toll was far greater. Her every step was a reminder that she was not free. Even her body, the one thing that should have been hers alone, was not her own. It belonged to the whims of her captors. The plantation was a microcosm of a larger system built on exploitation. The chapel was supposed to be a place of solace, but it was just as much a symbol of submission as the fields themselves. Inside those walls, the enslaved were told to pray for deliverance, to wait for freedom in the afterlife. But this promise of salvation came with a heavy cost, the cost of their souls, their dignity, and their silence. The chapel was not the place of liberation it pretended to be. It was just another mechanism of control. And then there was the brothel. In the same way the chapel offered spiritual exploitation, the brothel offered physical exploitation. Men and women reduced to objects for pleasure, trapped in a system that viewed them as nothing more than commodities. In this space, the lines between sin and survival blurred. It wasn't just about the body, it was about survival, about doing whatever was necessary to stay alive in a system that saw you as nothing more than a tool to be used. But the woman saw through it all. She understood the game. She saw the hypocrisy in the chapel and the injustice in the brothel. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set and the world grew still, she plotted, not just to escape or endure, but to strike back. The fire she would eventually set was not born from a moment of passion. It was born from years of suffering, from the quiet rebellion of her soul that refused to be crushed any longer. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been reduced to nothing, fighting to reclaim the one thing that had been stolen from them, their dignity. ****. The night the fire started, the air was thick with anticipation, though no one could have predicted the chaos that would unfold. For the woman, this wasn't just an act of vengeance. It was her moment of liberation. She had waited for so long, quietly biding her time, until she finally realized there was no other way to make her mark, to demand the attention of a world that had refused to see her. It was late, the kind of night that wrapped around you like a heavy blanket, muffling the world outside. The mansion was still, most of the overseers and plantation owners asleep, lulled by the exhaustion of their own privilege. The chapel stood tall and imposing, a reminder of the religious hypocrisy that had bound the enslaved in chains of false hope. The brothel, just steps away, was where the exploitation took place under the guise of pleasure. Both were symbols of a system that thrived on the suffering of others, and they were about to be erased. Her steps were calculated, every movement precise. She knew the risks, knew that being caught would mean certain death or a life spent in chains once more. But for once, she didn't care. The power dynamics had shifted in her mind, and the long hours of toil had finally given way to clarity. This was her moment of choice, her act of defiance against everything that had been done to her. And her people. The fire didn't spread quickly at first. It started small, a flicker in the dark easy to ignore for anyone who wasn't paying attention. But it grew, licking the edges of the chapel and the brothel, and as it did, it spread the message that had been burning inside her for years. This fire wasn't just a physical force, it was a symbol, a torch carried through the darkness to shed light on the injustices that had been hidden in plain sight. By the time the flames reached their peak, they were a roaring inferno. The sky above was glowing with an unnatural hue, as if the heavens themselves were witnessing this act of rebellion. The enslaved who had spent their lives under the weight of oppression watched in awe, as though the world had shifted in a single, fiery moment. The fire was an act of violence, yes, but it was also an act of release. For the woman, it was the burning away of years of pain, years of degradation, and years of silence. It was a moment where she became something more than just a victim. She became a force of nature, unrelenting and unstoppable. But the fire was also a beacon, a call to those who had long been oppressed to stand up, to fight back, to refuse to be invisible any longer. It wasn't just the woman who was liberated that night, it was an entire community, whose anger and pain had been waiting to find expression. In the aftermath, they would be left to pick up the pieces. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. When the flames finally died down, they left behind nothing but smoldering ruins. The chapel, which had once stood as a symbol of forced submission, now lay in ashes. The brothel, the place where so many had been exploited and broken, had been consumed by the fire as well. The night had changed everything, but what came next was an even harsher reality. The news of the fire spread quickly across the plantation. At first, the overseers were in shock, unable to comprehend the audacity of what had just happened. How could something so powerful and devastating have been unleashed from within their own walls? But shock quickly gave way to fury. The fire wasn't just the destruction of property, it was a direct challenge to the authority they had held for so long. It was an act of rebellion, and it demanded an answer. The woman who had set the fire was nowhere to be found. She had vanished, slipping into the shadows of the night, leaving behind only the haunting echo of her defiance. Her identity was a mystery, a name lost to history, but her legacy was undeniable. The plantation owners were livid, calling for the woman's capture with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The idea that someone could rise up from within their ranks, someone they saw as nothing more than property, was a threat they could not ignore. They searched high and low, questioning everyone, offering rewards for her capture. But the truth was, the woman had planned for this. She knew she couldn't stay. She knew that once the fire was set, there would be no turning back. She had made peace with the fact that she would likely never see her home again. But that wasn't the point. She had done what needed to be done. In the aftermath, the plantation was in chaos. The fire had taken its toll both physically and emotionally. The plantation owners struggled to rebuild what was lost. But it wasn't just the chapel and the brothel that had been destroyed. The fire had ignited something deeper, something intangible that could not be rebuilt with timber and nails. It had set alight a spirit of rebellion that no amount of force could ever fully extinguish. But the woman's actions didn't come without consequences. There were those who saw her as a hero, someone who had finally stood up, had fought back against the system that had tortured so many for so long. But there were others who saw her as a criminal, a wild force of nature that had disrupted the natural order. She had become a symbol, but one that was not easily understood. As the plantation owners and overseers scrambled to restore order, they could not ignore the underlying truth. Something had shifted, something that could never be undone. The woman had burned more than just buildings that night. She had burned the illusion of their absolute control. The fire that night did more than just burn buildings. It sparked a revolution in the hearts and minds of those who had long been silenced. The woman who set it ablaze became more than just a fugitive. She became a symbol of everything the enslaved had suffered and everything they could still hope for. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread like wildfire. Some called her a hero, a champion of justice, a warrior who had fought back against the horrors of the plantation system. Others called her a criminal, a villain who had destroyed the last remnants of what the community had known. To the plantation owners, she was an enemy to be hunted down at all costs. But to those who had been oppressed, she became something more. She became a myth, a legend that transcended the fire she had set. She was the embodiment of defiance, the voice of all those who had suffered in silence for too long. The fire she had set wasn't just an act of destruction. It was an act of hope. Hope that the cycle of exploitation could be broken, that change was possible. And in the minds of the enslaved, her actions spoke louder than any sermon in the chapel or any promise of freedom that had ever been made to them. But myths are dangerous. They inspire both admiration and fear. The woman became a rallying cry, a symbol of the resistance that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. As much as the plantation owners tried to erase her from history, they couldn't erase the truth of what she had done. It wasn't just a fire, it was a stand, a challenge to the system that had held her and so many others captive. People began to talk, some in awe, some in fear, but all of them acknowledging that something had changed. The woman had taken a risk, yes, but she had done something that no one else had dared to do. She had taken power into her own hands. She had rewritten the rules of the game. Her act became more than just a personal rebellion. It became a symbol of the collective anger, frustration, and yearning for freedom that had simmered for years. It was as if the fire had ignited not just the buildings, but the very spirit of resistance within everyone who had been enslaved. And though her face remained unknown, her impact was undeniable. But with every hero, there is a cost. The more she became a symbol, the more the lines between heroism and villainy blurred. Was she truly a liberator? Or had she simply become a destructive force, tearing down everything in her path? The answer wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. Her act had left a burning question in its wake. What does true freedom cost? And who gets to decide what justice really looks like? In the wake of the fire, the hunt for the woman who had set it ablaze intensified. But it wasn't just the plantation owners who sought justice, it was the system itself. A system that had been built on her oppression and the oppression of countless others. The aftermath of the fire revealed the deep cracks in a society that claimed to be just, but was founded on injustice. The question now was, what kind of justice would be served? The plantation owners were desperate to restore order. They wanted to make an example out of the woman, to show that rebellion would not be tolerated. They offered rewards for information leading to her capture, and they used every tool at their disposal to track her down. The manhunt was relentless as they scoured the area, hoping to bring the woman back alive or dead. But as much as they searched, they found nothing. The woman, as elusive as the wind, had vanished into the shadows to the authorities. Her actions were nothing short of criminal. But what does it mean to be a criminal when the very system you are part of is built on oppression? Was she really the criminal, or was it the plantation owners, who had exploited her and her people for so long, that were the true offenders? For the enslaved, the woman's act of defiance was something far greater than a mere crime. It was a challenge to the very foundations of their world. It was a question of what justice meant for them as people who had been denied it for so long. The legal system that would now try to judge her was the same system that had enslaved her, that had systematically stripped her and so many others of their dignity. How could a system built on injustice ever deliver true justice? The struggle for justice became a battle for truth. The truth that had been hidden for so long about the cruelty of slavery, about the exploitation of women in the brothel, about the hypocrisy of those who claimed to be moral leaders while upholding systems of terror, was now being brought to light. But would anyone listen? Would anyone care? The woman's disappearance did not mean the end of her story. In fact, her absence made her a legend. She became a symbol of defiance against the forces that had oppressed her. And though the legal system would try to brand her as a criminal, she was already becoming something more, a martyr, a hero to those who had long been silent. Her fight for justice, even if she never lived to see it, was far from over. And as for the plantation owners and authorities, they soon realized that they were not just fighting for a woman, they were fighting for control of the narrative. In the end, who would decide what justice looked like? Who would determine whether the woman's act of rebellion was a crime, or a courageous stand for the freedom she had been denied? As the years passed, the woman who had set the fire became little more than a shadow in the history books. Her name, lost to time, was never fully recovered. The details of her life were obscured by the chaos of the post-war South, and as the dust settled, so did the stories surrounding her. She became a legend, but a legend with more holes than substance, more questions than answers. It's not surprising that her story was hidden. The people in power, the plantation owners, the lawmakers, even the historians had no interest in telling the truth. She was a threat to the very fabric of the society they were trying to rebuild. If the truth of her defiance were to be fully known, it could inspire more revolts, more fires, and more rebellions. The last thing those in power wanted was a hero emerging from the ashes of a system they were trying so desperately to preserve. The fire she set, the rebellion she sparked, these events were reshaped, redefined, and reinterpreted to fit the narrative of those who held the power. Her name was erased, and the circumstances of the fire were distorted. To the outside world, she was just another criminal, another fugitive whose actions didn't deserve much attention. But to the people who lived on that plantation and to those who understood the realities of slavery, her story was far more than just an act of arson. It was a tale of survival, of resistance, of a woman who chose to fight for her dignity. For years, historians, biographers, and even the descendants of those who lived through it tried to piece together her story. What happened to her after the fire? Did she escape to freedom? Or did she meet a tragic end? Her life snuffed out by the same system that had kept her enslaved? The truth remains unclear, but the fragments of her life that still exist, those brief mentions, the half-forgotten whispers, point to a woman who didn't just fade into history. In fact, her legend lived on in small pockets of memory. The people who knew her or who had heard stories of her passed them down quietly in hushed voices. These were not the grand, celebrated tales told in history books, but the stories of resistance passed between generations, in the spaces where the powerful couldn't reach. They were the stories of people who, though broken by the system, had found a way to hold on to their dignity, even when it seemed impossible. And in the retelling of her story, there were questions that never quite went away. Was she caught? Did she die at the hands of those who hunted her? Or did she manage to escape into freedom, disappearing from history with a quiet but unbroken spirit? The answers remain lost, but the mystery of her fate only adds to her power. Perhaps it's because her story was never meant to be contained by the limits of a few historical facts. Maybe her legacy isn't defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the fire she set, the one act of defiance that refused to be erased. Though her name might have been lost to time, the impact of the woman who set the Plantation Chapel brothel on fire was far from forgotten. Her act of rebellion became a symbol of resistance, a powerful reminder of what happens when the oppressed refuse to remain silent any longer. The fire she ignited didn't just burn down the buildings. It sparked a fire in the hearts of countless others. It lit the way for future generations to see that standing up against oppression was not only possible, it was necessary. For the people who lived through the aftermath of the Civil War, and especially for the formerly enslaved African Americans who faced the brutal realities of Reconstruction, her act was a beacon of hope. It whispered that they, too, had the power to challenge the systems that sought to control and break them. Her act of defiance proved that even in the darkest times, when it seemed like the chains of slavery still bound everyone, there were ways to fight back. Her legacy became intertwined with a larger struggle for freedom and equality. Over time, as the South continued to rebuild in the shadow of Reconstruction, the woman's act began to take on new meaning. Her rebellion wasn't just a personal vendetta or an impulsive act of anger, it was the embodiment of the struggle for self-determination. She wasn't fighting only for her own freedom, but for the freedom of all those who had been subjugated by the same system. Her fire symbolized the breaking of chains, both literal and metaphorical. It was an expression of a deep, collective yearning for justice that transcended individual lives. And as the years passed, the myth of the woman who burned the chapel brothel grew. Her story was told in quiet circles, passed down from generation to generation. To some, she was a martyr woman who died for the cause of freedom. To others, she was a symbol of hope, someone whose defiance embodied the very spirit of resistance that would shape the civil rights movement decades later. Though her actions were never officially recognized or celebrated by the government or historians of her time, her legacy lived on through the stories that carried her memory forward. The act of rebellion she performed that fire became a metaphor for the fight against injustice, something that could never be fully extinguished. As the decades went by, the struggle she had faced continued to echo in the fight for civil rights, and her legacy became one with the ongoing battle for equality and justice. The woman who had once been invisible, erased from history, became a symbol that transcended time. She stood as a testament to the power of resistance, to the undeniable truth that one person, even when faced with the most overwhelming odds, can ignite a fire that will change the world forever. In the end, the story of the woman who set the Plantation Chapel brothel on fire is a story about how history often chooses to forget the voices of the oppressed, those who dared to fight back in ways that challenged the prevailing order. Her name may not have made it into the history books, but the very act of erasure tells us something crucial. It tells us that history is often written by those who have the power to shape it, and those in power don't always want the truth to be known. The woman's story was lost to time not because it was insignificant, but because it threatened to expose the uncomfortable truths about the systems of power and oppression that were rebuilding themselves after the Civil War. It threatened to show that not all acts of resistance are grandiose. Not all heroes wear medals or are celebrated in speeches. Sometimes, the most powerful acts are those that come from the most unexpected places, from those who have nothing left to lose. But the absence of her name in the history books doesn't mean her story wasn't important. It means that we, as a society, must be willing to look deeper, to question the narratives we've been handed, and to seek out the hidden histories that are often left in the margins. The story of this woman is part of a larger, untold history, one that is only now starting to be unearthed by scholars, activists, and storytellers alike. ***. The struggle for justice, for recognition, for equality, it's a story that never truly ends. Her act of rebellion was just one spark in a larger fire of resistance, one that would continue to burn for generations. Her legacy didn't die with her. It lived on in the hearts and minds of those who heard her story, in the generations who fought for civil rights, for freedom, for dignity. The question, then, is not just about remembering her, it's about what we do with her memory. It's about recognizing that the fight for justice is ongoing, and that every small act of defiance, Every refusal to be silenced is part of the larger struggle for human dignity. Rewriting history isn't just about telling forgotten stories, it's about making sure that the struggles of the past continue to inform and inspire the struggles of the present and future. We may never know the woman's full story, but in a way, that's part of her power. She is a symbol, a beacon of resistance that refuses to be fully defined. Her fire, both literal and metaphorical, continues to burn brightly, reminding us that even the smallest act of rebellion can change the course of history. And maybe, just maybe, her story is not finished. Perhaps it's up to us to keep it alive, to ensure that the flames of resistance she ignited never go out.